Hello, I'm Dan with Orbital Guitars, and over the next hour I'm going to show you how I made this guitar. See you on the other side. This video is effectively a sequel of sorts. Back in 2017, I had made a guitar, and there's a video out for that. It was just called something like, Custom Guitar Build Ziricote Black Limba. And a lot of people watched that video, and a lot of people hated that guitar. So I decided to effectively do another one with some changes. Well, first up, I was just ripping down some wenge so they can be a couple of strips in a 5-piece neck. And here I'm ripping down some black limba to be the other 3 pieces of the 5-piece neck. So once they're ripped to size, I'm going to go ahead and glue them up. This is going to be a neck-through guitar, unlike the last Ziricote and Black Limba. Being that this guitar, as you probably saw from the thumbnail, is just a Les Paul type of shape, I don't have any particular design name for this. It's just a guitar build. It's not any particular design of mine. So once the glue is dry, I'm going to go back to the table saw and rip off the excess from one edge. And of course the other reason, apart from just removing the excess, that I rip the neck like that is to make sure that the top edge is perfectly square to the sides. So now I'm working on another piece of black limba. This is going to be the wings of the body. But it's currently too thick, so rather than going to my planer and planing off all the excess material, instead I'm using a resawing blade on my bandsaw to cut off the excess so that I might be able to use it for something else later. So here I've got the pieces of Ziricote that are going to be at the top. Just using a small hand plane to straighten the edges so that the glue up will go better. And they book match quite nicely. So I've taped up all along the joint there. That's going to keep these 2 pieces perfectly aligned, as well as it's going to stop any glue from coming through onto the front, which is going to make cleanup easier later on. And just wipe away the excess. And apply some more tape this to the back side, which will prevent it from folding up again. So I'm going back to working on the neck blank, just removing the excess material from the sides of the neck. And removing the excess material from the front of the headstock. So I had gotten a little bit ahead of myself. Normally I would use a guide fence on my router to route the truss rod channel, but I would have had to do that before I cut off the sides of the neck. So instead I've got a straight piece of wood that I'm using as a separate guide. So you're just making sure the truss rod fits. And then of course drilling access for the truss rod from the headstock. The Limba didn't like this very much. Anyway, next up, putting a piece of tape to keep any glue from getting into the truss rod channel. And then applying the glue. And like I would have mentioned in my previous video, I've started removing the tape before putting on the truss rod because I feel it just makes the glue up easier and the connection better. And gluing on the fretboard. It's a nice piece of bird's eye maple. And it certainly doesn't hurt to have plenty of clamps on there. Yeah, so now after the glue is dry, and after the glue is dry, I'm going to go over to my router table and use a flush cut bit to remove the excess fretboard material that's remaining. There's a step I skipped in showing here where I used the bandsaw to remove most of the excess fretboard material, and then the router table was only shaving away the last little bit. Alright, now that that's done, I'm going to begin cutting the fret slots. Again, cutting them by hand, using the same technique I've mentioned in several other videos where I cut one end of the slot, then I cut the other end of the slot, and then I connect the two across the middle. Just the way I like to do it. Right, but unlike my last couple of builds, instead of using crushed stone for an inlay, I'm using actual wood. This is a piece of ebony that was left over from the Minotaur last year. Now this saw definitely did not have the appropriate blade for this sort of cut, and it really tried to fight me, but got there in the end. And of course, this being ebony, I was pretty concerned about accidentally chipping or breaking the pieces while I was cutting them, because ebony can be kind of brittle in that way. Alright, so with the pieces cut out, using some hand files to get them down to their final shape. And then using my Dremel, the precision router base and router bit, cutting the spaces for the inlays in the fretboard. And the nice thing about the inlays being wood, you get to put them in with wood glue. So here, again, concerned about the ebony being somewhat brittle, I don't want to hammer the pieces into place, so instead I'm using one of these clamps that has a fairly large face on it. I'm just going to squeeze the inlay bits into place. Of course, this last piece is the largest, so I added a little extra surface area to that clamp to help smooth out the install. So the ebony sticks out from the top of the fretboard a little bit at this point, so rather than going directly into radiusing the board, I'm going to level this off with a leveling beam. Okay, so here's a step that's new to me. This will be the first time I'm installing a Floyd Rose bridge and locking nut. What that means that here I need to cut away excess material from the top end of the fretboard. And yes, I accounted for this when I cut the fret slots. But I need to remove this material so that I can set the locking nut up here. And of course, I'm not going all the way through the bird's eye maple because a little bit of it still does need to be there in order for the locking nut to have the right height up above the fretboard. So now I'm ready to put in the radius. I'm just using a 14-inch radius block. I'm going to begin sanding that in. I almost said sanding that into place, but that doesn't make sense. So now I'm putting in the side dots. So as usual here, I just take the plastic side dot, dip it into a little bit of super glue, stick that into the hole that I drilled, and then use my fret cutters to cut off the excess. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking a small triangular file and just putting a slight bevel into all of the fret slots. That'll make the frets a little bit easier to install and a little bit less likely to damage the fretboard if they ever need to be taken back out. So one thing that I've done different on this build from some of my previous ones is I've left the full thickness of the neck material there so that I can much more easily use the fret press or arbor press to install the frets rather than hammering. And this is a nice way to do it because I don't have to have any other support pieces underneath the neck and have to deal with any potential wobbling of the material while I'm trying to press the fret in. So once all the frets are in, I'm going to use the fret leveling file and work down those edges so that they are not sharp any longer. You can kind of tell there right when you're starting, the fret ends can be pretty sharp from the fret cutters. They kind of leave a sharp point on at least one end of the fret, and sometimes even the leveling file has a hard time moving across them. It likes to catch. So now with the fret end dressing file, I'm just going to round over the ends of the frets. And I don't really have any set number of strokes with this file before I stop or anything like that. I just keep working at it, feel the end of the fret, work at it some more, feel the end of the fret again, and I'll know when it feels right. So after that's done, now I can go in and remove the excess material from the back of the neck. I'm just going to start by making a couple of relief cuts. So with the bulk removed, I'm going to take a half-round file and start shaping the volute a little bit. And then I'll begin carving the profile of the neck. Same way I always do it. So one of the things people always complained about with my previous Ziricote Black Limba guitar was how much they thought the neck pocket sucked. So this one doesn't even have a neck pocket. Deal with it. So once all the carving is done, I'm going to take my small random orbital sander and smooth it all out. So I'm going to move on to leveling the frets. Now at this point I will have checked that the fretboard is straight. I will have used a fret rocker to see if there are any high or low spots that I want to focus on, and then marked all the tops of the frets with some Sharpie before taking the leveling beam to it and working it all down. And then once all of the frets are level, I'm going to add a little bit of relief to the upper frets. And once all the leveling is done, I'm going to use a fret crowning file and work the top of the fret down to a thin black line of Sharpie. Let's see, that bird's eye maple looks really good in close up. So once I'm done with the crowning file, I'm going to take some sandpaper and work up through a couple of different grits up to around 600 and just work out any of the scratches left in the frets from the files. And once I'm done with the sandpaper, I've got some little buffing wheels for my Dremel. I'm going to use those to polish up the frets. So one last thing before I start working on the wings of the body, I'm going to shape the headstock. And of course, the headstock isn't quite wide enough already, so I'm going to add a little bit of extra material. And of course, these are just some offcut bits from the back of the neck. And again, back to the bandsaw, just remove the excess. And then to do some more fine tuning of the headstock on the spindle sander. You do have to be kind of careful with things like the spindle sander when you're working on a piece like this where there are two very different kinds of wood right next to each other, because the sandpaper will tear through one type of wood much more easily than the other, and you can very easily end up with some accidental lumpiness if you're not careful. So here I'm just rounding over the back corners of the bottom edge of the headstock. I like doing this just because I know whenever I'm carrying a guitar by the upper part of the neck, if that back of the headstock is a sharp corner, it can be pretty uncomfortable. So this little extra bit of carving is entirely just there for player comfort and convenience. Now I'm essentially done working on the neck for a while, so I'm going to go back to the wings of the body. And of course, first step is to get them cut out. So once they're roughly cut, I'm going to begin gluing them onto the neck. Now you can't really see it in the shot, but there's a long piece of tape along the back edge of that joint that's kind of keeping the wing in place. So I was noticing that the wing was trying to slide a little bit as I put the big clamp on there, so used a couple of smaller ones to stop that from happening. So once the glue is dry, going back to the bandsaw and just removing the excess material from the end of the body there. And once again, back to the spindle sander to work out the edges of the body. Then the surface isn't totally flat at this point, so I'm just going to my large random orbital sander and going to smooth that all down. Luckily, because all this was planned out ahead of time, there wasn't very much material that I needed to remove to get everything smooth. So now, because this is a neck-through guitar, and I can't just drill a pathway for the wires from the pickups directly from the neck pocket, I have to do something else. Because this guitar is going to have a solid top, I'm going to go ahead and route a channel directly into the top. And of course the router couldn't reach all the way where I needed it to, so I'm going to largely remove the rest of this material with the drill and then finish it off with a chisel. So again, I need to get these wires from the pickup into the control cavity. I'm sure somebody's going to be upset and start complaining that that path that you routed in there isn't super straight and clean and pretty. Once the top is on, no one's ever going to see it again. So then here I'm just using a Forstner bit to remove the bulk of the material for where the control cavity is going to go. And once that's done, I'm going to begin cleaning it up with the router. At this point, I'm going to begin working on the top. So what I'm going to do first is cut it out from the full piece of Ziricote. Or rather, the first thing I'm going to do is work on the neck pocket of it. Oh yes, even before I begin cutting out the shape of the top, I'm going to make this neck slot. I'm going to file it down very carefully to make sure it fits perfectly over the end of the fretboard. So after doing that and setting it on the body, I marked the underside around the edges of the body so that I know exactly where I need to cut these lines to have them line up. So now with that roughly cut out, I can glue it into place. I'm just being very careful to make sure that the top doesn't slide to either side at all while I'm clamping. Because if that happens, then you can end up where the center line of the top is not the same as the center line of the body, and that wouldn't be very good at all. Ideally, at this point, I would have wanted to use a flush cutting router bit to flush up the edges of the top, but given that the fretboard is there, and I wouldn't be able to do that all the way around the body, I decided to just use the spindle sander for it instead. So I'm working on routing the necessary openings for the Floyd Rose. So, in case you're wondering, StewMac makes these nice Floyd Rose routering templates. And you might notice if you go looking for those, they only make them for 6 strings. So some of you might be asking, well, how do you make that work for a 7 string? And the answer is, very carefully. Anyway, after I'm done with those initial routing templates, I also need to put a recess into the body, because otherwise the bridge would be enormously high and essentially unplayable. So the templates that StewMac makes for those were out of stock when I was working on this build, so I made a template myself. And it looks like it fits. So now that's done. Again, made some templates of my own for these pickup routings. So the pickups that I got for this guitar, they're the Cobra coils from Bare Knuckle. So a couple of reasons a regular router template wouldn't work for these. These pickups are just straight lines. They don't have that kind of triangular bit on the underside of them that a lot of other single coil pickups do. So it would have been just sort of a waste of material to route out any extra from a normally shaped single coil routing template. But I haven't mentioned before, this guitar is also 7 strings. So any regular routing template for those pickups would have also not been wide enough. There I'm just drilling out the holes for the controls and one for the jack. Now that's done, I'm going to begin putting in the bevel around the front and back of the body. So I put this bevel in using multiple shallow passes and just gradually raising the router bit until it cuts the bevel that I want. Same thing with the top, except for the top I have to use the handheld router because the fretboard is in the way and wouldn't work at all on the router table. And of course the handheld router also can't get all the way up against the fretboard, so the cutaway and part of the upper area on the left side I'm going to have to carve by hand. And saying by hand is an interesting point. A lot of people like to complain if I called this a handmade guitar. It's like, you use power tools, it's not handmade. As if the power tools would just make a guitar on their own without my hands controlling them. Like this angle grinder here. It's not going to make a guitar on its own. My hands have to control it. The only difference between using an angle grinder there and using a round file is that the angle grinder is faster. Yeah, moving on, I've just put in the comfort carve on the back, and now I'm carving out the transition of the neck to the body. I think this is one of my favorite things about a neck through a guitar, is just how smooth that transition is from the neck to the body. And of course, even though I say the angle grinder makes the job much faster, I still do use plenty of hand tools to do the more refined sections that need a little bit more caution, a little bit more finesse. And then going in with my random orbital sander and smoothing it all out. Now working with one of the leftover bits of Ziricote from the body, or rather this is 2 offcuts glued together. They still do book match a little bit. I'm going to make a faceplate for the headstock. And much like the Minotaur that I did in 2019, I'm going to recess the truss rod cover into this headstock plate. Of course, using a little bit of the offcut from the offcut to make the truss rod cover. Here I'm just matching up the center line so that there will be the exact same center line on the truss rod cover and the headstock plate. Now just very carefully working down that truss rod cover with the leveling beam until it's a perfect fit. And then I get to glue on the headstock face. You know, so I have another piece of wood just kind of loosely taped onto the back of the headstock. That's there as a clamping caul. The tape is just to keep it from falling before I get the clamps on it. So now, because this guitar is going to have a 5-way blade switch, I need to use my precision rotor base on my Dremel and just very carefully cut the slot for that blade switch. So what I'm doing here is I've started up the Dremel, I've very slightly lowered the bit, moved it across, lowered it a little bit more, back across, and I'd keep moving it back and forth across there until it's all the way through. I'm just drilling and countersinking for the screw to hold down the truss rod cover. And then drilling the holes for the tuners. Now ideally I should have done this before the wings of the body were glued on because that would have been a lot easier. Supposed to mention, a lot of people on my last Ziricote Black Limba guitar complained, it's so thick it must be unliftable by human hands, or some other dumb remark like that. What a lot of people don't realize is that Limba is a very lightweight wood. This was an extremely lightweight guitar, at least up until the bridge got put on it. Now I'm getting ready to put on some finish. I'm going to start by fine sanding the whole body up to 320 grit. Lots and lots of sanding. Limba does have some really pretty grain to it. First thing I'm doing here is I'm putting on some sanding sealer just to fill up the pores in the grain. Here you can really see some flame figuring in the Black Limba on the body there starting to show. Putting sanding sealer on the Ziricote probably wasn't necessary. It's a very close-grained wood, so this likely didn't make any real difference in the end, but I wanted the finish to be the same over every surface of the body. Once the sanding sealer is dry, I'm going to sand that down with some 320 grit sandpaper before applying the actual finish. So one last thing I'm going to do here first, I'm going to use this step drill to just recess the jack plate into the body. Not sure why it is I always like to do this, but I always prefer to do it this way rather than have any part of the jack plate sticking out from the side of the body. I don't know why it bugs me when it does that, but it just does. So here I'm putting on the final finish. For this guitar I ended up deciding to use a polyacrylic for a satin finish. Now, polyacrylic makes a really nice satin finish, but boy is it a pain in the ass to apply. I do not recommend ever using this for a guitar finish. A lot more trouble than it's worth. And like I said, the results are nice, and I'm happy with how this guitar turned out, but it could have turned out just as well, probably a lot faster and easier with a different finish. And of course applying some to the fretboard as well, because it's a maple fretboard and those need finish on them, because otherwise they can rot or be eaten by bugs. You wouldn't want that. And of course, even though I taped over all of the frets before applying the finish, I still need to clean off some finish that got under the tape, so just use some steel wool for that. So once I've got several coats of finish on the body, I'm going to wet sand the whole thing up to 1200 grit. And then I'm going to buff it lightly with some high cut compound to keep the satin finish. Yeah, the finish looks quite nice. And at this point I'm going to go in and put some shielding paint inside the pickup pockets, as well as the back cavity and the inside edge of the back plate. And then I'm also going to paint the recessed bridge area with some just flat black paint. There's really no reason for that to be the shielding paint as well. So now I get ready to install the tuners. I just have to drill for the screws that are going to hold them in place. And tighten them down. Now I'm ready to begin installing the pickups. So first thing, I'm just going to set them in place and mark out where to drill for the screws that will hold them down. Now these come with screws that are supposed to be attached to like a scratch plate, but I'm not using a scratch plate on this. It would feel really inappropriate to put anything over top of this really nice wood. So instead I'm going to super glue some bits of foam in place and then just direct mount the pickups onto the body. I really do like how the white pickups look next to this wood. And so then just installing the jack plate and the jack. And installing the locking nut. And a couple different ways you can install these. You can drill all the way through the neck and have bolts coming up from the back, or you can just drill into the front and have screws from the front. At least for now, I decided to just have the screws from the front. I've heard that having the bolts come through from the back is more secure, because the screws from the front can kind of work loose after you've worked the whammy bar a little too much or too often, but it felt a little bit better just to have them screwed on from the top rather than from the back. And then the joys of wiring. I know people have complained about me using the soldering gun before. It's just a more reliable way of soldering than any of the soldering irons I've ever used. So that's what I'm going to use. Just a quick test to make sure everything's wired up properly. And it all seems to be working. And of course you can see the ground wire sticking out there where it's going to be attached to the claw. And of course I need to install the claw. And then I just put the bridge in. Initially I put on 3 springs. Given this was a 7-string guitar though, it ended up needing 4 in order to balance properly. But 3 seemed like a reasonable starting point to try. And then of course installing the strap locks. Alright, so before I throw this over to a friend of mine for the playing demo, just going to run over a couple of things with this guitar. It is a Black Limba body, a 5-piece neck, 3 pieces Black Limba, 2 pieces Wenge. The fretboard is bird's eye maple with an ebony inlay, and the top is Ziricote. Now this is a 7-string guitar with a Floyd Rose and 3 single coil pickups. These are the Cobra coils from Bare Knuckle Pickups. I actually really like how these sound. And for those of you out there thinking, you know, a Les Paul style guitar with no humbuckers, you can't do that. Well, in a way you're right, because what I had Bare Knuckle do was make a reverse polarity pickup for the middle, so that when you're in positions 2 or 4, these pickup combinations act as humbuckers. Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to a friend of mine now, and we'll get right into the playing demo.
So we're going to run this with the blues driver. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through each position, and starting from the bottom, moving towards the top, and I'm just going to do the same thing over and over.